Thank you, Steve, for leading us in the worship. I have a confession to make, and that is that I forgot to bring my amplifier today. And so that's why the keyboard is possibly not as loud as it might have been, and it's also why I've got no microphone in front of me. So I shall try to keep up the volume. I know that I can lapse in that at times. I've no doubt that there will be somebody, at least, not naming any names, who will keep me right on that. She will probably indicate somewhere or another, speak up. But I'll try to avoid that, avoid a domestic in front of the congregation. Anyway, let's pray. Lord, we bless you that you are such a great God, that there is no God like you, that you alone are Lord, and that you have called out a people for yourself to follow you, to love you, to make you known, and that you have spoken to us through your word by your Son. Help us, Lord, to hear you today and to receive all that you would tell us, that we might live more effectively for you, with hope, with courage, and with endurance. In Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. Okay, last time I spoke, we began to look at the book of Nehemiah in the Old Testament. It was a time that I believe has many parallels with our day and age in terms of the kingdom of God. In those days, the kingdom of God was very much centered, in people's thinking anyway, on the city of Jerusalem and the Jewish people. And at that point, as we saw last time from chapter 1, the walls of Jerusalem were broken down. The city of Jerusalem and the people of Jerusalem were in a depressed state, and tied into that was the reputation and the glory of God. There was very much an identification with the Lord and with Jerusalem as the capital of his kingdom. And so Nehemiah feels distressed because of this. And as we look at the world today, as we look particularly at the Western world today and the state of the church, which is, at least in a big way, the current expression of the kingdom of God. We could take a long time to go into that more fully, but we won't. If we look at the state of the church today as being that expression, then it's very similar to how it was in Nehemiah's day with the city of Jerusalem and the reputation of the Lord. And so for many in our society, there is no regard paid to the Lord, except perhaps to use his word as a swear word, or to deride even belief in God at all. And so I believe that we live in a day where there are huge challenges to those who follow Jesus Christ and those who would like to see his kingdom come and his will be done. And that's really what we're looking at in this book of Nehemiah. Last time we saw in from chapter 1, the importance of prayer as we seek to further the kingdom of God in our day. The foundation has to be in prayer. And we saw, as we read into chapter 2, that Nehemiah's desperate plea of chapter 1, calling out to the Lord to restore Jerusalem, that prayer began to receive its answer as the king noticed Nehemiah's sadness. So we're going to read chapter 2, and then have a few thoughts from that. So chapter 2 and from verse 1. In the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was brought for him, I took the wine and gave it to the king. You remember, Nehemiah was the cupbearer of the king. It was his responsibility to first taste the wine before it was given to the king, and then to give it to him. So he took the wine and he gave it to the king. I had not been sad in his presence before. So the king asked me, "Why does your face look so sad when you're not ill? This can be nothing but sadness of heart." I was very much afraid. As I said last time, he was afraid because to be sad in the presence of the king was actually a capital offense. He could have lost his life because of it. You mustn't make the king sad. So I was very much afraid. But I said to the king, "May the king live forever. Why should my face not look sad when the city where my fathers are buried lies in ruins and its gates have been destroyed by fire?" The king said to me, "What is it you want?" Then I prayed to the God of heaven, and I answered the king, "If it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in his sight, let him send me to the city in Judah where my fathers are buried, so that I can rebuild it." Then the king, with the queen sitting beside him, asked me, "How long will your journey take, and when will you get back?" It pleased the king to send me, so I set a time. I also said to him, "If it pleases the king, may I have letters to the governors of Trans-Euphrates, so that they will provide me safe conduct until I arrive in Judah. And may I have a letter to Asaph, keeper of the king's forest, so he will give me timber to make beams for the gates of the citadel by the temple, and for the city wall, and for the residence I will occupy." And because the gracious hand of my God was upon me, the king granted my requests. So I went to the governors of Trans-Euphrates and gave them the king's letters. The king had also sent army officers and cavalry with me. When Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite official heard about this, they were very much disturbed that someone had come to promote the welfare of the Israelites. I went to Jerusalem, and after staying there 3 days, I set out during the night with a few men. I had not told anyone what my God had put in my heart to do for Jerusalem. There were no mounts with me except the one I was riding on. By night I went out through the valley gate toward the Jackal Well and the Dung Gate, examining the walls of Jerusalem, which had been broken down, and its gates, which had been destroyed by fire. Then I moved on toward the Fountain Gate and the King's Pool, but there was not enough room for my mount to get through. So I went up to the valley by night, examining the wall. Finally, I turned back and re-entered through the valley gate. The officials did not know where I had gone or what I was doing, because as yet I had said nothing to the Jews or the priests or nobles or officials or any others who would be doing the work. Then I said to them, "You see the trouble we are in. Jerusalem lies in ruins and its gates have been burned with fire. Come, let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, and we will no longer be in disgrace." I also told them about the gracious hand of my God upon me and what the king had said to me. They replied, "Let us start rebuilding." So they began this good work. But when Sanballat the Horonite, Tobiah the Ammonite official, and Geshem the Arab heard about it, they mocked and ridiculed us. "What is this you're doing?" they asked. "Are you rebelling against the king?" I answered them by saying, "The God of heaven will give us success. We, his servants, will start rebuilding. But as for you, you have no share in Jerusalem or any claim or historic right to it. So, in this chapter, as we consider the building of God's kingdom expressed through the rebuilding of the walls of Jerusalem, what we see are two things: preparation and opposition. Nehemiah is given permission by the king, very unexpectedly, miraculously you might say, to go and to set about the job of rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem. So in thinking about the preparation for this, the first thing that we see in Nehemiah here is a sense of calling. He knew himself to be called to this work. Now, I don't know, and it doesn't give us any indication in chapter 1 as to whether this is the case or not. I don't know whether he felt that calling before he began to pray, or if it came as a result of his praying, and perhaps even of the result of that last little arrow prayer that he makes in verse 4 of chapter 2, when the kings confronted him about being sad, and it says, "Then I prayed to the God of heaven." I don't know if it was just at that point, or whether it was something that had been growing in him up to then, but whatever way it was, he had a sense that he was called to the kingdom for such a time as this, and that the rebuilding of the walls of Jerusalem was his particular task. And if we're going to be part of the building of the kingdom of God in our day and age, as I believe God is calling us to, it's interesting that that revival has generally come at a time when it's the lowest point in the history of the church. So if you look back at the history of revivals, you find, for instance, in the 19th or the 18th century, both had revivals. And in both situations, the current state of society was so bad that people were bewailing the moral standards. People were faced with huge social problems. There were all sorts of troubles, and the church was in a desperate state. And at that point, God sent revival and transformed not just the church, but the whole of society. So, as we look at the church of Jesus Christ today, as we look at our society today and see the multiple problems that confront our society, then we can be encouraged that this could be the time when God could change everything. And he's calling us to be his agents in that. Just as he was calling Nehemiah at this point, he gave Nehemiah that sense of calling so that he could step forward to fulfill it. And he gave him also wisdom for doing that. Sometimes Christians are not noted for their wisdom. Have you seen that? Sometimes we speak out of turn. Sometimes we say the wrong thing at the wrong time, and we can get ourselves into all sorts of difficulties, and sadly often that impacts on the kingdom of God as well, because it affects the reputation of the God whom we serve. All those Christians that just talk nonsense, and sometimes we do. There are times when I can think of, here's one example. Back in the 70s, there was a book came out, and I'm trying to remember the name of it just now because I hadn't even thought of it before this moment. But it was a book really saying that Jesus was coming back next week, more or less. And it looked at the Vietnam War and compared it with the book of Revelation. And it said, the napalm bombing and the use of the helicopters. Well, the helicopters with the guns at the back of them, they were the part of the weird creatures in Revelation. And therefore, Jesus is coming back. The end of the world is nigh. Well, we know the end of the world is nigh. It's been nigh for 2,000 years now. but it's getting nearer all the time. But we don't know the specific date or time, and we're not supposed to try to find it out. We're supposed to get on with serving the Lord. But that particular book had a huge impact on the church at the time, and I think it also had a huge impact on the world's opinion of the church, because it was manifestly wrong. Sometimes we can do that sort of thing. We need wisdom. We need wisdom for living faithfully and serving the kingdom of God in our day. So Nehemiah had wisdom given to him from God. He was given wisdom about the protection that was needed. Verse 7, he says, "If it pleases the king, may I have letters to the governors so that they will provide me safe conduct." He had wisdom about the materials he needed. "May I have a letter to Asaph, keeper of the king's forest, so he will give me timber to make beams for the gates," and so on. He had wisdom as to when to speak and when to be silent. Oh, that's good wisdom to have, isn't it? How many times have I got myself in trouble by opening my mouth at the wrong time? Not necessarily because I've got things wrong, but it just wasn't the time to say it. Nehemiah got wisdom as to when to speak and when to be silent. He said, "I'd not told anyone what my God had put in my heart to do for Jerusalem." That's in verse 12. And then it says that again in verse 16. The officials didn't know what he was doing because he hadn't said anything. Verse 17, "Then I said to them." The right time had come. He needed wisdom for that. And we see a reflection here of the way in which Jesus operated. Particularly if you read through John's Gospel, you'll see several times it says Jesus said something like, "I speak only what I hear my Father say. I do only what I see my Father doing." And there's great wisdom in that. If we seek to build the kingdom in our day and generation with God, then we need to be hearing God, because we can't do it ourselves. And God has given us, through Jesus, his Spirit, who will give us access to the Father, to hearing the Father's voice, so that we know what to do. So, as part of the preparation for this work, Nehemiah was given wisdom in various ways, but not just wisdom, he was given strategy. Wisdom tends to be an inward thing. Strategy, then, is the outworking of wisdom. You can't have the one without the other, but they do go together as distinct things. And his strategy is manifest here. First of all, in gaining a first-hand impression of the situation. He'd received reports back in the previous chapter, and that was 6 months prior to this. When he arrives in Jerusalem, it had been 6 months since he heard the first report. And he had no reason to believe that the report he'd received was inaccurate. However, he goes and looks for himself. And it's a very good practice when we're dealing with any information that we're given, particularly information about the church, about the kingdom of God and where it's going, information on matters that affect our faith. It's good to get a first-hand appreciation of the situation, and not to depend on others' reports, particularly not to depend on Mr. Google. Can I say, there's lots of good stuff on Google, but there's lots of nonsense out there. I remember a few years ago, the then leader of our organization, denomination, what do you want to call it, was a lovely, godly man, but he sent out something that he'd received from America. And it was to the effect that the scientists at NASA, oh, must be right then, scientists at NASA said it, had discovered a 24-hour time discrepancy in their calculations about the universe. 24-hour discrepancy. Oh yes, that must be when the sun stood still in Joshua's day. Wait a minute. How could they possibly, if these scientists in NASA believe the world was created billions of years ago, how do you identify a 24-hour discrepancy in billions of years? It's like trying to say your watch is a second out, or less than a second, a millisecond out in its time. And having some way of measuring that. Also, how do you know that there's a 24-hour discrepancy if you don't know when everything actually started? Because you've got to measure it from a starting point. And you see, what was actually happening is that somebody who was not a Christian, not a believer, was sending this stuff out to see if the Christians would believe it, and then to laugh at them. So we need to be very, very careful that we examine what we have been told and that we get a first-hand appreciation of any situation that faces us in serving God. Second part of his strategy was envisioning and strengthening the people in their faith for this. The people that he was talking to were discouraged. It was now, I think, about 100 years since the temple had been rebuilt, and nothing had been done to restore the city itself. They had somewhere to worship, but they had no security, they had no reputation, they had no standing, and the people were discouraged. And so the first thing that Nehemiah seeks to do is to encourage them and to lift them up and say, look to God. Look to the Lord, who is above all things and who's able to do far more than we can imagine. And that's what he does. Because you see, serving in the kingdom, while it involves us as individuals, will never be effective unless we're all working together. And that goes in also to what Nehemiah did, because after envisioning them, he then involves them. He says, let us build the walls. He doesn't say to them, I'm going to build the walls. He says, let us build the walls. He knew he couldn't do it on his own. Sadly, for many years within the church, far and wide, a model of ministry has been set whereby one person or a small, very small group of people do everything and the others just sit back. Not because they necessarily want to sit back, but because there's nothing for them to do. And we need to rediscover the giftings of God, the call of God, and to mobilize each other, to strengthen each other to follow. If you go to 1 Corinthians 12, you find Paul describing the church there as the body of Christ. And he says, in the body, there are all different members, different limbs, different bits and pieces. Some of them, he said, you cover up because you don't want to expose them. Other bits you use more openly because they're functional and not embarrassing. But he says it's the same in the church. There are different members, and each member has a function. Sadly, we all too often forget to involve each other and to receive that calling to be part of the body and to find out which member we are, which gifting we have. And that, when it comes down to it, I suppose that's down to the leadership seeking to encourage all of us into finding our gifting and entering into our ministry and doing it together for the glory of God. So the preparation involved receiving wisdom and receiving strategy. And both of these came from God. And that's where they have to come from in our day as well. Sadly, however, in spite of all this preparation, there was opposition. And again, this is something that whenever there is a move of God, whenever there's a work of God happening, there will be opposition. You'll see more of this as we go through Nehemiah. These characters are mentioned here. They're just sort of beginning to flex their muscles in this chapter. They've got an awful lot more to do as the chapters go on. And whenever you look at a work of God, whether it's in the scriptures or whether it's, again, we've spoken about revival, in days of revival, there's always opposition. Never fails. Jesus, as he set out on his ministry, was tempted by the devil. He was faced by the Pharisees and the Sadducees and others who opposed his ministry, questioned his right to be doing these things, really just were a thorn in his flesh. And Peter says in his letter, his first letter, that the devil is like a roaring lion, prowling around looking for someone to devour. And the more prominent we are in serving God, the more we draw attention to ourselves with him. Sadly, opposition to the kingdom of God most frequently manifests itself through people with other agendas. Think about, again, going back to the 19th century or 18th century revivals. Opposition, sadly, often came from within the church. The term that many church leaders used for John Wesley and George Whitefield and the others who worked with them, and this was meant to be a derogatory term. They called them enthusiasts. What a terrible thing to be an enthusiast for God, isn't it? And one vicar who was very much out of, he had no sympathy with what was going on with evangelism or church growth or whatever. He had a bell cast for his church. And on the bell, when they cast, they often have an inscription put on the bell. His inscription was "Damnation to enthusiasts." True. Crazy. And so often that kind of opposition comes from within the church or from people with other agendas, people who've got grievances against the church for some reason or another, people who are manifestly atheistic in their outlook. Here in Nehemiah, you find three people mentioned. You've got Sanballat the Horonite. What a handle to go through life with. Sanballat was actually a Samaritan. And we know more about the Samaritans from their encounters with the Jews later, and particularly from the things said in the New Testament about them. But basically the Samaritans were a group of people who had been brought from elsewhere and planted in what had historically been Israel. And they brought their beliefs with them, and then they added belief in the Lord or worship of the Lord onto that. So they saw themselves as worshippers of the Lord, but they had all this other panoply of gods whom they worshipped as well, and all kinds of practices that they undertook that were not consistent with worshipping the Lord. And so that's who Sanballat is. He's one of this group of people who had mixed ideas about the Lord. And then you've got you've got Tobiah the Ammonite. The Ammonites were descended from Abram's cousin Lot, or nephew Lot. And they were descended from his son, whom Lot fathered with his own daughter. But more importantly, you find throughout the Old Testament a bitter hatred of the Israelites amongst the Ammonites. When the Israelites came out of Egypt, the first people to attack them were the Ammonites. And they kept that up over the years. So here's a guy who's got a deeply rooted history of hatred for God's people. And then you've got Geshem the Arab. And again, the Arabs are descended from Ishmael, Abram's son with Hagar. And the Arabs have always opposed, and even down to the present day, by and large, are opposed to Israel. So these are people with an agenda. And people who definitely don't want to see the prospering of the kingdom of God. And we'll come across people like that as well. If we seek to serve God in our day, if we seek to build his kingdom under his authority, we'll come across this opposition. At the moment, that's all I want to say about it. That it'll happen. We'll encounter it. Hopefully, as we go on over the weeks, we'll see something about how to actually handle it. The final thing I want to mention is this, that following on from the preparation and the opposition, Nehemiah has an assurance of the future and of the success of what he's going to do. He talks a lot about the gracious hand of God upon him. He says in verse 8, because the gracious hand of my God was upon me, the king granted my requests. He says in verse 18, I also told them about the gracious hand of my God upon me and what the king had said to me. In verse 20 he says, I answered them by saying, the God of heaven will give us success. We, his servants, will start rebuilding. And as we seek to serve God in our day and age, we can have the same guarantee of the gracious hand of God upon us. As we listen to him, as we seek his wisdom, as we seek his strategy, as we seek to live faithfully for him in our day and age, he will give us the boldness to stand. He will give us everything that we need for the job that he's called us to. And we can hope for greater things than we've seen in many, many years, because the gracious hand of our God is upon us. Let it be, Lord. Amen.